Brasil é atrativo para o investimento internacional? O que leva um investidor a alocar dinheiro aqui ou em outros países emergentes? Bem, para responder essas e outras dúvidas e contar como o Brasil pode ser a bola da vez, convido ao palco Axel Christensen, estrategista de investimentos para a América Latina na BlackRock. Daniel Popovic, gestor de portfólio da Franklin Templeton. E, na moderação, o MKBR recebe Cassiana Fernandez, economista-chefe da América Latina do J.P.Morgan Brasil. Participem enviando suas perguntas pelo QR Code que está impresso no verso dos seus crachás. Bom painel.
Thank you very much. This panel is going to be in English. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. As I said, very well explained already. This has been a very challenging year for emerging markets in general, actually for investors in general, right? With all the repricing in US yields. But yet, when we look at Brazil, Brazil had a strong growth, has surprised the upsides on the growth performance in the last 3 years, solid external accounts, has made significant progress in the reform agenda since 2016, and inflation, when you compare to the rest of the countries, have been performing very well, 3.7 within the central bank target range, yet is the worst performance among emerging markets in several asset classes. So, a question, I will start with you, Axel. What explained the underperformance of Brazil? And to the point of the panel, how do you compare Brazil with other emerging markets?
Well, bom dia. Thank you, everyone. My name is Axel Christensen. I think I have to say that I have a gray hair. I use eyeglasses. I'm wearing a blue suit and orange tie, laranja, I think is the word, black shoes, and if you can see, I'm also using Chuck Norris socks today. Okay. So I appreciate your question. I think it's a difficult one to answer directly, precisely because emerging markets has been a very dispersed asset class. You've seen some markets do quite well on the back of some structural changes going on that I'll refer to in a second. Others been lagging a lot. If anything, there's been a lot of idiosyncratic components into emerging markets. Now, in the specific case of Brazil, of course, we're looking at a market that is perhaps one of the most sensitive to interest rates, not just for foreign investors, but primarily for local investors. In my experience, I've been at BlackRock for some time. Before that, my life was as an investor. I've learned to understand that, for instance, in equities, it seems to be like a, like a side asset class. Like the default investment for Brazilian locals is fixed income. If fixed income is not doing that well, let's look at equities. It's not like the first thing that local investor comes to mind. And some of that transpires into how global investors look at the equity market as well. Now, let me do a couple of positions, perhaps that might help to understand. One has to do with, you are absolutely right. If we look at some of the elements relative to of Brazil, relative to other emerging markets, it certainly stands out. It stands out in the good way. You always want to stand out in the good way. Other markets are standing out in the opposite direction, but it's been quite stable. We've seen the central bank being able not only to anticipate a higher inflation and act more earlier than most central banks, but they've done a good job in bringing rates down as much as they can, controlling inflation, of course. The fiscal aspect, which is always something that global investors look at Brazil, although it's getting more competition nowadays, especially from the US, has been also quite stable. If anything, and this is probably most relevant for the equity markets or more growth-oriented type of asset classes, the concern is how can Brazil deliver on long-term growth? We've had very good recent growth numbers, but if we look at long-term perspective of growth, economic growth in Brazil, it is still somewhat underwhelming. It is not, the growth is not strong enough, especially to compare to other emerging markets, and increasingly so compared to developed markets in some of the sectors. So if I'm a global investor and I'm looking for opportunities in Brazil, there are plenty. It's a large market. It has seen a development of the Brazilian consumer, the middle class. We've seen it's a very strong market in terms of commodity-linked type of sectors. As I mentioned, there are some links to more structural changes going into the world, including more demand for some of these commodities. And yet, if I look at the overall economic growth perspective of Brazil and say, compare it to some sectors, especially in other emerging markets or in the US, like technology, Brazil would have to do better to get more interest for investors looking at long-term perspectives. So there's that element that I think is important to stand out. That the other thing perhaps is we have to look with a broader perspective. So we've seen some growth in interest in Brazilian companies or Brazilian-based companies very strongly, but it happens that these companies are not necessarily listing themselves in the Brazilian local market. They're going directly to the US. Even so that some of the index providers have had to adjust the way they count when they include, for instance, in the Brazilian universe of companies that are listed, for instance, in the US, but that they derive their business. So Brazil has been, and their companies have been getting interest from investors. It's thus perhaps the challenge is how to get more companies to start listing themselves in the local markets and not go directly. So we're looking at things that we can get better, things that I think we have to look more into. I'm very interested in your macro perspective, Cassiana, to see how can Brazil solve the challenge of having a more attractive growth story to come to the world. This emerging market is a very competitive market. You have to have a good story. Nowadays, I would say Mexico, barring what happened during the weekend, but has a very interesting story, very attractive story for global investors around nearshoring and the potential. India, despite again the elections of this weekend, also has a very compelling story that attracts interest around technology, around demographics. Perhaps, Brazil has to work on getting a more interesting story as a starting point to get more attention from investors.
No, perfect. Thank you very much for that. I'm sorry, everyone. I forgot to describe myself. I'm a white woman, kind of blonde hair, a little bit light hair, not interesting socks, wearing black. So Daniel, to you now, in the same direction, how do you see, what is the things that attract you most on the Brazil assets, and what are the main challenges that you see for the asset classes?
So, good morning, everyone. Just describing myself. So I'm a white man, dark hair. I'm wearing a blue suit, a white shirt, and black shoes. And so, first of all, I think, Axel mentioned, I think, very interesting aspects that we have to consider about Brazil. What is our growth story? I think that's the main question we have to ask, especially compared to other emerging markets. Now, what can we do, or what do we have that we can enhance or leverage to participate in a next trend of growth or to just stimulate our internal growth. So there are some interesting aspects. I think Brazil has been undergoing important reforms lately. Sorry. We have made an important labor reform. We are going through a tax reform, which is very important. And those reforms are important because by themselves, they can enable the Brazilian economy to unlock value, right? Let's consider the tax aspect. The tax system in Brazil, it's Byzantine in a way. It's very complex. How can a foreign investor, let's say, or a foreign company come to Brazil and make investments, long-term investments, if you don't know by how much you're going to be taxed, or even worse, if you are going to to do a tax planning, and you might end up in a legal action with the government and having to settle tax disputes. This is a very important question that needs to be addressed. So simplifying the tax code is something that is underway, but there's more progress that needs to be pursued by the government in that sense. Now, we do have some very positive things. So in a geographical and geopolitical way, we are quite lucky. South America has been more or less isolated from, I think, the main global conflicts we're seeing around the world. So Brazil can be a player when we discuss energy security, for example. We have a lot of room for investments in infrastructure. And this is also, I think, a field that we saw a lot of progress, but there's more to be done. We saw a democratization of investments in infrastructure. And this is the path we need to continue on if we are to pursue growth, right? So I think those are some of the positive aspects. We also have very competitive companies in Brazil. And again, going back to what Axel mentioned, how can we attract those companies to be listed in Brazil and attract foreign investors to those companies? We do provide innovation, but Brazil is not the first country that a foreign investor thinks of when he thinks about investing in innovation in technology. How can we change that? How can we change the rules, the legal coding, whatever needed, so we can enhance this part? And perhaps one last comment, which I think it's important to keep in mind, and being a portfolio manager of global portfolios, but being also a Brazilian, it's a quite unique position and quite interesting one. When I talk to my peers, they're sitting in the US, in Canada, in Europe, and I always like to ask them, like, so what's your view on Brazil? Are you thinking about Brazil at all? And a lot of the comments we receive is that those portfolio managers, they always think about Brazil in a tactical way. So like I see a major dislocation in the equity markets, should I perhaps, buy some? Or maybe, I don't know, like if we see a dislocation in fixed income, perhaps I should set a carry trade in Brazil. But the disappointing part is that the discussion on strategic investments in Brazil, long-term investments in Brazil, they never occur. So this is something that, like reforms, I think democratization of investments can help put us in the right way, or make Brazil the next growth story.
Oh, perfect. So both of you talked a lot about growth. This is definitely the missing link when we compare Brazil to other emerging markets. But I think that's one very interesting point, and for the interest of this audience, all the discussions, how foreigners look at their investments in Brazil. So let me ask to you, Axel, when you are in your portfolio meeting and deciding where to invest. There is this part that you do need to have a thesis, an investment thesis, and growth is so important. But what else? How do you make the decision whether to invest in Brazil or Mexico? How do you do this comparison how do you compare Brazil with the other Latin America countries? Because to be honest, the other Latin America countries also do not have such stellar growth as well. the average a little bit higher than Brazil, but not stellar as we have in Asia and other regions.
Yes, the answer is, let me start by saying it depends on the asset class, of course. I don't have to spend a lot of time convincing my colleagues about how interesting, how attractive the Brazilian carry trade is. That's definitely, we do see that as a long-term opportunity. Some things that you've mentioned before about, a lot of stability in terms of central bank policy, very focused on, bringing inflation down. I think the fact that in Brazil, the discussion about fiscal policy is a constant, I would also highlight as something good. I think in other places, in other emerging markets, or even in the US, investors and analysts don't talk about fiscal policy as much as they should be, and it's becoming a strong concern, as Governor Campos Neto pointed out. So I think I would set aside not a lot of promotion needed on the fixed income side. Now on the equity side, we come back to the growth issue in terms of understanding. Global investors do get a lot of feedback or signals from local investors. And local investors in Brazil, our perception, they are very smart investors. They are not like dumb money or something like that, which would probably characterize other markets. So we do look at what local investors are doing. We think there are even understanding the asymmetries of information that might happen. But perhaps it's also important to understand that our perspective on Brazilian assets compared to local investors will always be different. And this is true if I talk about Mexican assets or Colombian assets or wherever. There will always be a difference. And let me just give you a very brief story to understand this, and hopefully. So, and this is meant to be a joke. I'm sorry if it's not that funny, but so there's a hen, a female chicken and a pig. They want to, build a restaurant together. They want to have a restaurant business together. So the hen says, of course, and we should name the restaurant The Hen and the Pig. We'll serve breakfast, scrambled eggs and bacon, everything great. And the pig says, wait a minute. The name, of course, should be The Pig and the Hen. My name first. And the hen looks perplexed and says, why is that? Because, of course, putting on the eggs in the business, you're very much involved. But I put the bacon, I'm really committed. So that's the difference between local and global investors. Global investors were involved, but we look at the Brazilian market as one component, one part of a very well-diversified global portfolio. You guys, local investors, you guys are committed. You have probably most of your investors, you work here, you have probably your pension savings here. So definitely the perspective will be different. We will be looking into what local investors do as a signal, but definitely we understand, at least I try to share this with my colleagues as well. There's always going to be this difference between the commitment and the involvement that you have to understand when you look at how money flows. But going back, growth, of course, is going to be something very important. I definitely share what the infrastructure opportunity that Brazil has, the energy security. I would add the source of food security that also Brazil brings to itself and the rest of the world. There is plenty of things to say about Brazil that would get my colleagues enthusiastic about the long term. Perhaps it's just getting the narrative together, and Brazil has done that in the past in a very good way. But getting, and the story, I would say, is going to be good when you get the local investors to be as enthusiastic. So I would take it back and say, what story, how can we bring a story together to get local investors enthusiastic about local market? And I assure you that global investors will follow.
Perfect. So to you, the question, what would make you bullish and optimistic about the Brazil story?
That's a very tough question. So I think a lot of what we discussed so far is very important. I think, so on the equity side, let's consider this one first. I think the main aspect is, again, the growth story. So reforms, like changing the rules of the game here. So we create a more friendly business environment in Brazil. Again, we need to consider, again, like the legal system in Brazil is quite complex and different from the rest of the world. Taxation, again, is an issue. But I think, rates coming down would also be a tailwind to Brazil. That's something that we need to consider. The cost of capital for Brazilian companies is very high. So if we somehow manage to bring interest rates down, that would be very positive to Brazil. I think enabling more investments into the country, into infrastructure, or attracting more technology into the country. We have this huge agricultural sector that could benefit from international investment flows to Brazil. So I think that on the equity side, and also creating a growth story. We need to find our growth story. So that will help us, I think, at least on the equity side. On the fixed income side, again, I think the fiscal policy is key. If we manage to find a way for a more balanced fiscal policy, at least one that enable investors to see a path for fiscal normalization that would enable the central bank to lower rates, it would be very important. I think it would attract a lot of foreign investments to Brazil. At least in my portfolio, that's something that we would consider. For now, we have been wary of adding more to emerging market fixed income as a whole, and that includes Brazil. And the reason for that is, one, we do have a strong pressure from US interest rates, but we also have idiosyncratic factors. So let's say that interest rates in the US, they continue high for longer, but we see a more benign fiscal trajectory in Brazil. I think it could motivate a lot of investors to be overweight Brazilian fixed income. So that's something I think we need to monitor and be hopeful.
So let me also step out a little bit from the moderator role, but also talk about, as an economist, what would make me be more optimistic about the Brazil story. I think that's definitely, I agree. You all said it's growth. I do believe that the implementation of the VAT tax reform can be a game changer in the future. So I am getting more constructive on that story. It's just that it's still time to go, and we still have some details to follow as well. To have well-designed rules, but also extremely important is rule of law. While all the reforms are extremely important to improve our regulation and the rule of the game, it's also important to have stability and to understand what are the rule of the games and to have stability on that. It's super important. So those things is still a challenge. The spending review that the government is trying to implement, it's going to be extremely important. I think that it has a lot of potential, but we still don't see enough willingness on the public sector in general to actually implement that. So those are the things that I would be watching to say, yes, we definitely see higher potential GDP going forward. It's still not the case. You also mentioned, despite the growth, the lack of a narrative, a single story for Brazil. Like Mexico has the nearshoring, you have all the technology shifts on the supply chains in India, and Brazil has a lot of small ones, right? Food security. We are very competitive on commodity, minerals, energy, food, and we do have a lot of advantage on the technology as well. Everyone saw the central bank panel early this morning, a lot of progress on that. I do believe this will have an impact on productivity. It's just that it's, as a macroeconomist, it's very hard to measure that and to anticipate that. But another story usually taken on Brazil, at least in the past, I mean, since the early 2000s, has been China, because of the commodity trends, the importance of China to South America in general, Brazil in particular. And we have been seeing a shift in this Chinese story, lower growth, worse demographics, some changes on the policy uncertainty as well. So how do you see this Chinese story affecting your investment decisions in South America and Brazil in particular?
Yes, this is a very important question. And you're absolutely right. Most of the optics around emerging markets until recently was always through China. China has a very strong growth story, or at least it had. You know, it's the biggest demander of commodities. So everything in emerging markets, some way or the other, was connected to China. And suddenly China is not the engine it used to be. There's a lot of issues that are surfacing. And what I would point out is, even despite that, some of the other structural trends that we're observing, you know, the need for more food security, or the impact that the energy transition has on demand from some critical commodities such as copper, lithium, have been able to balance out the fact that Chinese demand might be going, lower. But let me, point out to something also very interesting going on. Investors looking at emerging markets are separating China from the rest of emerging markets. And that actually has a positive effect on the rest of the emerging markets, because suddenly the linkage through China is not the only way to kind of get this country some focus. So we talked about nearshoring in Mexico, we talked about other things. Suddenly, a lot of emerging countries, and I have no doubt that Brazil can do this as well, are starting to have some space to tell their own story and not necessarily have it linked to China. So I would take that opportunity as investors, and for several reasons. It might be economic growth, there are other issues that involve other investors, but take advantage of these, who knows how long, minutes of your own airtime to tell your story. So yes, it is a risk, especially for commodity-linked countries like Brazil, but it's also opening an opportunity to talk more about Brazil in itself and not necessarily going through China.
Perfect. Danielle, anything to add on the Chinese story? And also, looking at we are almost on the top of the hour here, but looking at other asset classes like the local corporate bond markets had been developing quite well, had been growing a lot in Brazil lately. But on that, we haven't seen a lot of involvement or participation of foreign investors at all in that market. So how do you see the opportunity for global funds to increase their exposure in the local markets through local corporates or other assets on the equity as well?
So I think the local currency fixed income is a very interesting asset class, but it's one that makes investors very cautious. So again, we have to keep in mind, so the FX is a big part of the risk taking into this investment. And we have a lot of uncertainty regarding FX at this moment. Again, we need to keep in mind that major developed economy central banks are perhaps, we just saw the ECB cutting rates, but there's a lot of uncertainty of when the Fed is going to cut rates. And it's all relative. When the Fed will start cutting rates matters for Brazil, it matters for Brazilian monetary policy as well, and it affects the exchange rates. So I think this is one of the aspects. Again, what Brazil can do to add value to its currency, leaving aside the discussion on interest rate differentials. So again, it goes back to fiscal policy. Perhaps the main challenge we have in enabling the central bank to cut rates is the fiscal policy. There's a lot of uncertainty regarding inflation, regarding government debt. So I think the FX part can be addressed in this way, just partially. Now, on the local side, so the investors that do their homework, so an active investor can find many compelling opportunities. Now, we have to think how easy it is for a foreign investor to come to Brazil and invest in local fixed income. What's the market structure to enable this type of investment? What's the standardization of the Brazilian fixed income or private credit to attract and make it easier for foreign investors to come to Brazil? I think that's a very important question, and I would say that it's quite different from a standardized bond market that we see in international markets. So I think this is one of the topics that we need to consider in attracting capital to Brazilian fixed income, local currency at least.
Perfect. So we discussed a lot about long-term investment in Brazil, and it's about growth, it's about a lack of story, but he also mentioned on the short term, it's still about carry trade, at least on the fixed income market. So let us have some more practical input here. What would you make you in the short term? What's the trigger that you think that we need to see a better performance of the Brazilian markets in the short term, and if anything in the medium term as well?
Sure. So I won't go into more details about the fiscal situation. I think it's been touched upon. Definitely, there's more operational aspects, and I guess this audience is more actionable around it. More work in terms of providing more liquidity and more debt. I would think a challenge is getting more companies to list themselves, to provide more opportunities. I understand the market has been quite dry in terms of new IPOs. So definitely provide more options of investments. Arranging for the platforms to allow new investors to come into the market as well. I would really highlight the advances that Brazil has in terms of digitalizing and tokenizing its payment system. It really, I think, goes in that direction. Getting more participants in the private and public credit markets. There's amazing companies in Brazil, but for global investors, especially the size of BlackRock, liquidity issues are very, very difficult. We call them internally, the Hotel California markets. And if you're familiar with the song, Hotel California, you can go in anytime you want, but you can never leave. So this is a situation many times with some of the investments. So think about how to bring more liquidity, more transparency, try to reduce some situations of asymmetric information of global versus local investors is also something that comes to mind as well.
Perfect. Daniel, any recommendations, and what are the trigger in the short term that would make you more optimistic? Don't not talk about growth. We already know that.
Interest rates. I think interest rates coming down in Brazil would be a very positive, especially for Brazilian equities. And one thing that we just, it's important to highlight.
One thing, when you talk about interest rates, the trigger that you're waiting is Brazilian rates or your global rates coming down?
I think ultimately it's Brazilian rates, but it can detach itself from global rates. So anything that would bring local rates down, I think, would be very positive for local equities. And so one last thing is, when we look at valuation multiples, when we look at valuation multiples for the Brazilian stock exchange, the Brazilian stock exchange trades, like the main index trades at much lower levels compared to our peers. It trades lower for a significant time than Mexico after it had a major fall in the market after the Mexican elections. It trades below India for sure. It trades below Taiwan and other countries. So perhaps, again, going back to reforms, if we see more reforms, more commitment in terms of policy to enhancing the business environment in Brazil, perhaps that by itself can generate enough momentum for us at least to review valuations in the Brazilian market, and that by itself can attract investors to be overweight Brazil, to bring money, to invest in the local stock exchange and capture that movement. So I would say that those are two possible short-term drivers of returns.
Okay, perfect. We are already below schedule here, so I have to end this panel. It was a great discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for watching. And as you saw, we need growth in Brazil to see for investors being more optimistic and also Brazilians as well. Thank you very much.